Good evening, friends. Welcome to the India Power Talk. India Power Talk is a knowledge sharing initiative. We invite international thought leaders and domain experts to share their insights, experiences, and strategies related to business and economy. Today's topic is future of public transportation in cities. Today's top three transport challenges are congestion, stretch, and cost. Are complex, requiring responses that are both strategic and creative. And to talk about this complex and interesting subject, we welcome Mihir Benison from London. Mihir, uh, good morning to you and welcome to India Power Talk. And thank you for your valuable time and engagement. To begin with, could you tell us about your work and expertise as senior transport and city planner in the UK?
I suppose to answer your question, I wanted to start with where my interest lies, and it's really in the intersection of between how transport can create and shape places within cities. Transport can impact densities, land values, but also the healthiness of communities, and I really love the complexity that those sorts of projects bring. I feel well, you've covered sort of the variety that I've had in my career so far. And I think it's really provided me with a breadth of experience, which means I can really act as an integrator at upstream planning projects. So projects at a very early stage in their process, where quite a lot of decisions need to be made, which influence things downstream. You've already mentioned some of the organizations I've worked for. So I've worked on the client side for organizations like Network Rail and Heathrow Airport Limited, but also within consultancy, as I'm doing now with Arup, but also previously for some architecture firms. And so I have an understanding of how complex client organizations function, but also how work is procured and delivered. And I try to complement this with my work on the panels that you mentioned with the GLA and Harrow. So it's really sort of trying to understand how people make decisions, how they form their policies. And what this requires is an appreciation of multiple disciplines. So in my current role, I'm really able to bring together some of the best architects, urban designers, economists, town planners, environmental specialists, and transport consultants as well, to help shape these projects at a really early stage.
India is a vast nation, both geographically and by population. Now, instead of asking your view on the current state of affairs in Indian transport system and bothering you with that, let me ask you what Indian cities can learn from UK and the rest of the world when it comes to transport and city planning.
I think the biggest lesson India can learn is really to think about growing cities in a human-centered way and really thinking about what streets should be for. And they really need to be for people. They need to be designed for people. And this is really important as we think about the recovery from COVID and the shift
Absolutely.
towards zero net carbon. And the thing I wanted to explain to you is really the way I like to think about the hierarchy of transport modes. So if we think about an inverted triangle where the flat part is at the top and the point at the bottom, what we want to do is we want to have the cycling and the walking at the top. And we want to promote this as the low carbon and healthy way of getting around our cities, particularly for shorter journeys. And then as we move into the middle of that triangle, there we should have trains, buses, and other mass transit, which are good for slightly longer distances or where you might not wish to walk or you can't walk or cycle. And then at the bottom of that triangle, at the point, we want to have the taxis and the private cars, which are really the least efficient modes and should be reserved for journeys which can't be completed conveniently in the other two ways that I've just described. But I think it's taken us a long time to learn those lessons of the damage that these big roads, channeling through our cities can cause, and the impacts to health and well-being as well in the longer term. I think we also need to think about how we value pedestrians. There's a recent report that was published by the Living Streets Foundation in the UK called the Pedestrian Pound, and it cites quite a few examples where actually investment in improving public realm, pedestrianization of streets, giving more street space to people has resulted in much greater levels of footfall in our town centers and more spending, people spending more time as well in those locations. Transport for London developed the Healthy Streets Indicators, which establishes this wheel of 10 indicators against which you assess the quality of the proposed urban environment.
Let me now, Mir, ask you your view on rising car ownerships, particularly. Do you think so? The increase of the multiple models of cars and the ownership as such would impact Indian cities?
Yeah, I think India is as you mentioned, is a vast nation. It's got a huge population. I mean, car ownership levels in India compared to the UK and to the US are quite low. And you know, that's probably a function of affordability levels. But we must sort of remember that. But you know, as the wealth in India rises, there could be a considerable impact in India. I mean, at the moment we have in India 41 vehicles for every 1,000 inhabitants compared to 471 in the UK and 838 in the US. So you can see the scale of or the magnitude of the difference there. But you know, if we start approaching similar levels of ownership as the UK and the US in India, the impact could be absolutely massive, right?
Absolutely. But then the question, Mihir, is how do we tackle the congestion on the roads?
We need to think about how we make the car less attractive. So what do we have available? We have things like taxation, restricting or banning vehicles, increasing the cost of motoring in other ways, and just making it less convenient overall. But then
In
we
Delhi,
also
in
go ahead.
Delhi, here in Delhi, recently we experimented by having odd and even numbers of cars plying on the roads.
Yes, and I thought that was a really interesting way of doing it, and I think it's something that probably India could implement in quite a quick way. I suppose a comparable approach that we've got is in London. We have a daily congestion charge that is applied, so it's £15 per day. There's also been a separate vehicle emissions charge introduced for more polluting vehicles, and there are other cities that are introducing this sort of charging. But what that's done is, in a 10-year period since it was introduced, it's resulted in a 10% reduction in traffic volumes between 2003 and 2013. But it's hard to determine what that level of the charge needs to be, who it should apply to, when it's applicable, and how it's enforced.
And given the need, urgency of the public transportation, how can we create and deliver attractive and safe public transportation and an active travel networks, as quickly as possible, efficiently, and in less resources? What would be your inputs on that?
So one example I wanted to cite of the impact of rising car ownership is sort of taking Mumbai as an example, and it kind of hints at how congestion can make cities no longer function properly. So if we look at Mumbai, commuters from northern residential areas such as Borivali traveling to the city's central business district, such as Lower Parel, are faced with losses of up to 350 rupees every day per person, and that congestion cost is split 100 rupees in lost wages and then 250 on fuel every day. And these costs really hurt the city's productivity, and there are also other implications where the residents in North Mumbai may not seek employment, for instance, in South Mumbai, even if it matches their skill set. So you're kind of limiting that pool of potential talent, and this is going to create poor access to suitable candidates if employers are based in the South. But then the sprawl that we also mentioned, that is also going to become the case as businesses maybe choose to locate in areas which are more accessible, away from congestion. So I think we probably need to sort of go back to the basics, sort of what is going to create an attractive transport network, and think about some of the basic needs. So it needs to be safe, clean, and convenient. I think those are really the basics.
Yeah.
But I think ultimately India is going to have to develop some longer term plans for its cities because of the length of time it takes to deliver these sorts of projects. And we really need to think about embedding that good design and architecture right from the start, because some of the decisions taken at the early stages, and if you don't allow the active provision and the space for railway lines or bus routes or cycle routes, they're very difficult to then weave into
Yes.
the urban structure, aren't they? I wanted to also point at the importance of stations and the role they play. And stations is something I'm quite passionate about. Seeing stations as a center of movement for people. So
Mhm.
really thinking about how they can be efficient places of movement, how they need to be located, how the entrances need to be distributed, thinking about the interchange between different modes, and how you avoid that penalty that happens when you change between modes. The second principle is them acting as a driver for inclusive and sustainable growth. And then the third principle, which maybe sometimes gets forgotten about, is ensuring that stations are at the heart of healthy communities. And this is really about what stations enable for people, and they enable access for employment, access to amenities, access to friends and family.
On how technology is changing the world of transport, because in the introduction, I mentioned about the drones and lot of fanciful instruments which are really fast forwarding the entire concept of transport. Could you dwell upon that?
I think we've already seen the impact technology can have on the way we move around. I mean, look at Google Maps, for instance,
Absolutely.
and the information we have available on our phone now. The live information, including timetable data for trains, tells us how congested our roads are and how busy individual carriages on a train might be. But I think one of the great recent shifts, particularly in Europe and citing London particularly, has been the shift towards smart and digital ticketing.
Mhm.
TfL have been pioneers in this by creating the Oyster card in 2003, which is a contactless payment card. And what they did maybe differently to others was they made it so you could use it across buses, tubes, then brought
Yes.
rail into that as well. You can use it on the river boats, and now you can even use it on a cable car across London. But I think it's essentially transformed travel across London. And the technology has now evolved to include contactless bank cards, and it's rendered paper tickets pretty much obsolete.
Mhm.
So, I can leave my home, and I don't even need to think about how I'm going to get to my friend's house across the city. I just, plan this out using an app, and, tap, 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 and I've made my way through. And bike rental is also becoming quite big across our cities, and micro
Mhm.
mobility as well. So, the e-scooters, which the UK actually banned, and now they're starting to trial again in a more regulated way.
No, even
But I think
India,
the
we are even in India, in some of the cities, we are thinking of starting these scooter cabs.
Uber and sort of those sorts of models, I think, are interesting, but we need to look at the sort of negative sides of them as well.
Absolutely.
Because one statistic I read about was in San Francisco, congestion actually increased by 62% between 2010 and 2016 as the ride sharing platforms became more mainstream. And so, whilst I think they offer a really great convenience, I think the whole point about congestion isn't addressed by them, which is interesting. It's sort of thinking about EVs, electric vehicles, and hydrogen. vehicles,
Absolutely.
which are very much starting to become more and more mainstream.
EV is
And
becoming the buzz of the trade of the next decade, I guess.
definitely, we should think about what impact that will have in terms of taxation and tax revenue in particular, because a lot of the UK's tax revenue does come from petrol and diesel tax. And if that tax base is going to reduce because we're going to start plugging our cars in and we're going to use hydrogen, where will that money come from to fund and infrastructure enhancements?
In the recent report by the World Economic Forum, they spoke about flying cars.
Yes.
And this idea is not new, and also but I guess it will face every country will have its own regulatory issues. But my question to you is, are we approaching a breakthrough in terms of technology, because by virtue of the flying cars? And what would be as a planner, what would be your thoughts on the flying cars or the roadworthy aircrafts?
I think it depends where we see their role. I think if I go back to that mobility as a service point, I think it needs to be less about thinking about ownership of these types of vehicles and where they fit in and where that gap is that they could fill. So perhaps flying cars would be good for areas where there isn't sufficient public transport provision, where there isn't public transport provision and there is limited road provision.
Yes.
So maybe where there are relatively few highways and you want to get from A to B quite quickly. So I don't think that there'd be something that I would encourage within cities, but perhaps in more rural areas, or
Absolutely.
where you have island
Yeah.
nations with lots of islands, I think that could be a very interesting proposition. If we think about how some of our cities have evolved, being tall, lots of skyscrapers, particular of cities in China, think about Dubai, US, you have to get from your apartment, which might be on the 50th, 60th floor, to the street level. It might take, less time to actually go to the top of the building. So do we need to think of a network actually that exists at ground level, which is already quite developed in a lot of cases, and a network that exists at the tops of the buildings, if you like, and allows maybe deliveries to happen at the tops of buildings because it's more efficient. Maybe the streets are congested and actually Amazon can deliver parcels much more easily
Mm-hmm.
to the tops of buildings.
We can't conclude the discussion without talking about COVID and the impact that we are going to have. So, what do you think, Mihir, would be the long-term impacts of COVID particularly on the long term on the transport network? Because we have to maintain social distancing, and this will become a norm, I guess, for at least for some time.
So I think I'll start by just saying, like, I think COVID's created basically a shock to our cities, a shock to our transport infrastructure system, and because of the long lead times for infrastructure projects, the only way our infrastructure has been able to respond is operationally. So timetables have been changed, or longer trains or shorter trains have been provided, and we look in the UK, and train operators are reducing services by 50 to 60% in the current lockdown, which is the response. But in the longer term, there are likely to be some permanent changes to our behavior. I mean, in many cases, offices are shut now. We're working from home, and so how much of that is going to result in us, permanently changing the way we live and work and move around? I mean, interesting, in the short term, we've seen increases in demand for private vehicles in the UK, and actually used car values in a lot of cases have gone up.
Same in India.
And yeah, I can imagine this is true across the world. It's predicted between 30 and 70% of staff will either work remotely or in a hybridized way, you know,
Yeah.
part of the time in the office, part of the time at home. And what that's going to do is it's really going to change that demand profile for how we use public transport, how we use roads, how we occupy our cities. And what is tending to happen is people are starting to think about moving away from city center locations into suburbs, you know, areas with gardens, more green spaces. But also, if they're not having to commute every day, they're actually choosing to even move to a different city.
Yes.
And so the sort of models and demand models that we were using to plan our infrastructure are now completely out of the water. You know, we don't know for sure, you know, whether we need to build that new railway line or widen that road. And so it's really causing some challenges there. And as you mentioned, we may need to procure different types of rolling stock on the railway, or new types of buses which allow you to flex how people occupy those vehicles, because you know, as the transmission number changes, you might need to introduce social distancing at short notice, but the current rolling stock and current vehicles maybe don't allow that. And I think one particular area where we probably need to have more integration is actually between how we invest in digital infrastructure,
Yes.
because in some respects, the Zoom call as we're on now has actually replaced the need to travel.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
so how do we sort of put you know, pitch the investment in fiber optic cables against a new motorway, for instance? And I think that needs to become far more integrated.
Thank you, Mihir. It is pleasure talking to you.
You're most welcome, Nathan. Thank you.